I'm Ashley Easter.
And I'm Charlie Grantham, and you're listening to Serendipity,
the podcast where we explore everyday magic all around us. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Serendipity podcast. Today we're going to be talking about being your authentic self and what it really means to be authentic. Charlie, I think you came up with this idea, and when you mentioned it, I was like, yes, I'm all over that. Because I really do think that so many people are living their lives inauthentically for a variety of reasons. And it just makes a difference when you're able to be free to be yourself. So
yes,
you want to kick us off? Because I think you had some things come up. You talked to your therapist about this, and I really want to hear your perspective on this.
I'm like trying not to smile too big because I'm so excited. I love this topic. I could talk about it because it's changed my life, like what my therapist has told me and how I've kind of like implemented being my authentic self. So I guess like a good question to bring up maybe at the beginning is like, what does that mean? Like, what does it mean to be your authentic self? And so I feel like we'll probably answer that because I feel like you probably could answer it in a few different ways, but I think you and I probably are on the same page. We'll see. I would think so on what it means, but just like a little background. This whole thing came up in therapy for me because it was actually kind of at the focus of the podcast. So it was last year, maybe like a month or two before we started recording the podcast. And I was really, really anxious. Like I literally was like, why did I decide to do this? Like
I didn't even know you were going through that.
I know. I'm like, this is well, what I like texted you. I'm like, you want to start a podcast? You're like, yes. And then I'm gonna be like, actually, I'm too afraid to do it. Like, but I was kind of like, oh my gosh, why did I do this? My gut reaction was I wanted to start a podcast. The second I thought of it, I texted you. Like it was like a Sunday morning at like 10 a.m. And I was like, actually, like, do you ever think about doing the podcast again? And it was like my gut reaction was just so excited. Like I have to text her right away. But then when like time went on, I was just like, I'm so nervous. And so I really brought that up with my therapist because I was like, I want to enjoy this because I want to do it, but I also don't want to do it because I feel afraid of talking about things that I feel like I know people aren't going to agree with. I feel uncomfortable with people judging me about certain things. I think for a while I was scared to like admit that like I don't believe in hell because I was so afraid of hell that I don't want anyone else to think I'm going to hell, even though I don't believe in hell. Like, you know? So like that was really like hard for me. And just like different things about not just the podcast, but like about religion, about life. Like I just felt not that I went around like agreeing with everything everyone said. I mean, and I think a lot of it maybe came from my first blog about Christian feminists, which we've talked about, how I felt people were like different to me after and like mean or like didn't want to talk to me or like mean and Nate or whatever. And so I think a lot of it came from that. I was like, okay, well, if I shut it all down, I don't ever have to like feel judgment. I don't ever have to feel, whatever. And so it's almost like I had a mask on to an extent. And so I guess what I mean by that is like, society, there's different roles that we fill and we all fill multiple roles. And it's almost like, I was like, I knew which role I was in when I was in it. And I did what I need to do for that role. So like, if you're at work, you don't talk about anxiety. You don't tell your boss that you can't work because you're anxious because that's not going to look good, like that's not, or whatever. And so anyway, going off on a tangent here, but I brought it up to my therapist and she kind of said, when you're living in your authentic self and you're being your authentic self, when you're living in what you believe and who you truly are, it's like a ripple effect throughout the whole universe. And when you do that, what you're doing is inviting someone else to be their authentic self. And I was like, what? Like, I don't, but it actually makes so much sense. If you're showing up with who you truly are, you're taking like the mask off. You're inviting someone else to say, "Hey, I'm showing up as me. Like you can show up as you too."
Yeah.
And it really deepens human connection. Like our connection with each other deepens when we're like not wearing these masks. And
Right.
so I think I was scared because I was like, the podcast, it was like, okay, there's not really going to be a mask on. Like we're just talking about like, you know, all these random things that we talk about that I wasn't really talking about with anyone else other than you or Nate.
Right.
I wasn't like, "Oh, hey," to any friend, "Do you believe in aliens?" Or like, "What do you think about
Right.
ghosts?" Or like,
Exactly.
"What do you think about like, religion?" And whatever we would talk about. I wasn't really doing that with other people. And so it was scary because now people are going to hear, and then I was scared of like being wrong about things. And so when she said that, I was like, that stuck with me. It was like one of the first things that I learned in therapy. And it was like ever since then I've been trying to think of ways like, how do you do that? How can I be my authentic self to invite others? And I think something important to note here is just because what you're doing is inviting others,
Uh-huh.
it doesn't mean you're responsible for like however someone acts. In
Yes.
my experience, a lot of people have been really nice, and when I am my authentic self, they then are their authentic self, and it's been really great. Some people aren't though, and they're not going to be. They may be judgmental or rude, whatever. The way I see it is by inviting someone, by being your authentic self, you're sending the invitations. You're not collecting the RSVPs. Like you're
I
not
love
like
that. Yes,
like
say that
you're
again.
not you're sending the invitations, you are not collecting the RSVPs. So you're just putting it out there. You're not in charge of the guest list. You're not trying to see like, if somebody is judgmental to you when you're being your authentic self, that's not your concern.
Right.
And so that's something I had to realize too was, yeah, it is an invitation, but people aren't always going to respond, or they're going to respond to an option that was not on the RSVP.
Right.
So I think that's important to know because I am going to give some really good examples that are like fun and serendipitous, but not everyone's going to act like this. I think for the most part, like people are, I think most people want to show up and most people want to take their masks off as well.
Mhm.
But some people, have other issues. So I have a few stories and I think it all kind of what I've learned through being my authentic self is, like I said, I've had better connections with people, with strangers. It helps to combat feelings of anxiety because then you realize you're not alone. I think that's one of the most like powerful things is really knowing you're not alone
Yeah.
in something. That's why it's important when people like talk about their mental illnesses or like whatever, like, oh, like you too, or like the Me Too movement. Like it's really
Yeah.
powerful when you realize that, hey, you know what, you're not the only one. Like you have an entire, I don't want to use the word army because I don't like that, but basically a
Right.
group of people
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
with you. And so that's something I've learned and feeling less pressure, I guess, to conform to things that I don't want to conform to and feeling like freer. And it honestly has really helped, which sounds like it wouldn't, but it's really helped me like feel less affected by what people think of me.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, which is crazy because I'm actually being more of just myself and I'm less concerned about people's opinions of that.
Mhm.
Um, so some examples, I feel like the examples will kind of show what I mean by being your authentic self.
Mhm.
So this is a recent one. I had to take a flight by myself and it was like I had I guess it was like 4 flights total. And I was
Mhm.
just really nervous. I've really never been afraid to fly, but I was first time flying by myself in a really long time. So I don't know if that like
Yeah.
triggered something, but I was like really nervous. And I am a little bit like claustrophobic. Like I kind of freak out, excuse me, in like smaller spaces.
Yeah.
And this plane was like really small. Like I think it was like 2 seats and then 1 seat, like, and the aisle
Oh
was in the
gosh.
middle of that. Like it was like,
I've been on one of
small.
those.
And yeah, it's not fun. Like I don't, but I was like, okay. So I get onto the plane and someone's in front of me, and it's like he kind of turns and sees like the plane, and he was like, "Oh, I can't do this." And he walks out. Like that's what he said. And he just walked off the plane. And I was like, oh my gosh. And then I turned, I'm like, see how small the plane is. I was like,
Yeah.
oh my gosh. Like he probably, maybe he was having a panic attack because I'm
Mhm.
about to have one. Like, so I go sit down. The guy comes back and he sits down. He's right in front of me with whoever's with him.
Yeah.
And he seems like very upset. Like, he's like putting his hands in his or his face in his hands. He's looking around a lot. His whoever's with him is like stroking his hair and saying like it's gonna be okay, like you're gonna be okay, and like and I'm like, oh my gosh, like he's really freaking out right now, like, and and I'm starting to freak out, and
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
I had bought this like Sudoku book to do. It's like a, do you know what that is?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
It's
like
like
a, okay,
numbers and stuff. Yes. Not good
numbers,
for
yeah.
dyslexic, but I'm familiar
Yeah,
with the
probably not. Yeah.
concept.
But I had just learned to do it because it kind of helps with my anxiety because it's like you're
Yeah.
just repeating like the game and
Yeah.
whatever. And so I was like, I'm gonna do this on the airplane because I'll focus on this instead of focusing on dying, like and we start to take off. And I mean, it's like you're feeling it, the plane's kind of shaking, and I'm like, oh my gosh. And the guy literally, like, we just started like going up and we're like kind of like still back a little, like when you're taking off. And he
Yeah.
like turns around and looks at the flight attendant who's close by in the back and was like, Is that the bathroom up there?" And she was like, "Yeah." And I'm like, "What? Is he gonna throw up? Like, why is he asking? Like,
Right.
he must be so
Right.
nervous." So my thought is, okay, he's really anxious. I'm getting really anxious. And then I remembered about being like your authentic self. And I was like, how can I be my authentic self right now? And so
Mm.
it's like, okay, you know what? Maybe he needs this Sudoku book more than I need it. Like maybe it will help him because I think he is freaking out more. Like whatever was going on, like nobody was like, I mean, I didn't have anyone with me, but nobody was like petting my head saying it was going to be okay.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
but so I was like, okay, like you can do it. Like just be your authentic self. Like you don't know these people, but it's okay. And I like lean forward and I'm like, hey, are y'all anxious about the flight? And they like looked at me and the guy was like, about the flight? And I was like, yeah. And he was like, no. And I was like, okay, I read this totally wrong. Like
Right.
I
Right.
just did not, he's obviously maybe anxious about something else. And so I was like, in that second, I was like, okay, you can say never mind and sit back, or you can like be your authentic self and just like
Yeah.
have a connection. And so I said, oh, okay. Well, I was just going to say, if you're anxious, like I'm anxious too. And
Yeah.
the girl looked me like dead in my eyes and was like, well, if you're anxious, don't be, because we are right here with you and everything's going to be
Oh.
okay. And it just hit me. Like when she said that, all the anxiety, all the worry just left me. And I
Wow.
was fine for the next flight too, that they weren't even on. I was
Wow.
fine because it was like I had someone, okay, you know what? I'm not alone. Like these other people, you forget sometimes because everyone's looking at their phone or reading, like nobody's really paying attention. Like I am, I have these people with me. And at
Yeah.
least she, said that. And I was like, wow, like what a powerful experience that I didn't even want to say, like, because kind of, I'm not super embarrassed anymore to talk about
Sure.
my
Sure.
anxiety, but like it's a stranger and I'm just
Sure.
like,
Sure.
I'm anxious, by the way. Hi.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
for her to have that response, I was like, wow. And I just felt so much better and so connected to other people. And I just didn't feel alone anymore. I really didn't. And I'm not saying you have to tell people that you're anxious. I think, or have to tell or disclose anything to anyone. I think this kind of is where the intuition comes into play,
Yeah. Definitely.
knowing what you should share with people. Like what's your intuition saying in that moment? That's what my intuition was saying. Like just tell them. Like just
Yeah.
tell them. And and that's was the result. It was amazing. And the same thing, like I had a few months ago, I had to get blood drawn at my doctor's office. It's just like routine blood work. And
Right.
I like developed this fear of like needles and stuff within the last year or so. And I was just like,
Mhm.
did not want to do this. And Nate wasn't there. And I was just like freaking out. I was just like, oh my gosh. And so I thought, okay, just be your authentic self. So I literally told my doctor as she's getting stuff ready, I was like, I'm really nervous. Like, I really don't like getting my blood drawn. I'm really like scared. Like, I don't, I just want you to know. And she was like, oh my gosh, really? And I was like, yeah. She's like, well, it's going to be okay. She was like, I actually get really nervous getting my blood drawn. And my little kid has to hold my hand. And like
Oh,
in that moment when she said that, I was like, she's the one doing the blood drawing. She
yeah.
is a doctor and even she gets nervous. And I
Mhm.
was fine. Like I literally felt fine after that because it was like my feelings of anxiety probably didn't go away completely. I mean, I was still getting a needle put in my arm, but I felt so much better and like lighter. Like I wasn't in a frantic, what's gonna happen? What's gonna happen? It was more like, okay, this is gonna be uncomfortable and I don't want to do it, but it's gonna be okay, you know. Um, so that's another example. And I'm trying to think, I have like just so many things are just like jaw dropping. Or like one time I was
Yeah.
anxious at work, like at my new job. It's not new anymore, but at the time I had
Yeah.
just been there like 2 weeks. And this is when I realized I actually like um I mean, I think everybody was, but like I didn't realize the negative impact staying inside for like
Mhm.
or a year and a
Right.
half
Right.
from the
Yeah.
pandemic had on me. Like I thought
Yeah.
I was fine, right? But I was actually really scared to leave the house, and I didn't
Mhm.
really realize that until now I have a job where, like, I'm working in person,
Yeah.
and I would have horrible panic attacks at work.
Oh.
I mean, just, like, horrible, and it was, like, bad because I don't like to go back to where I have panic
Mhm.
attacks, but it's, like, in my office, I kinda, like, have to
Right.
go
Right. You
back,
gotta go back.
so
Yeah.
right, there's, like, no getting around it, and one day it was just, like, really bad, and I was like, "You know what? I'm just gonna be honest," and this was at the very beginning of working there. Like I didn't know my
Mhm.
boss well or anything. And I text her and said something like, "Hey, is it okay if I go home for the rest of the day? I'm really anxious and I don't know why." And
Yeah.
she was just like, "Oh my gosh, absolutely. I'm so sorry." And I was like, thank you. I'll work from home." And she's like, "No, don't even worry about working. Like, just rest. Like, please feel better." And it was like this great connection. I'm sure not everyone's like that. I'm sure not everyone's boss will be, but I think
Sure.
more and more nowadays, I think they probably would be more than like 20 years ago, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and so that was another thing. I was like, wow. And then she ended up saying something about like, oh, her horoscope said something was a bad day for something. And I was just like, oh, I was like, well, that's interesting. I like to read the
Yeah.
horoscope too. Um, but
Wow.
anyway, so it's just things like that. I think a lot of that was centered around like I think all of my examples were centered around anxiety
Mhm.
because that was something for me. I was always putting like this mask up of like I have it all together. I'm not anxious. I'm not whatever. But inside, it was like a hurricane happening, and so I think that's why so many of my experiences are centered around anxiety because like it's like I want to seem like, I'm not anxious.
Right.
And I
Right.
actually am less anxious when I'm like, just, I tell everybody now, like, oh, yeah, I'm anxious about that. Oh, yeah. Like, I'll joke about some of
Right.
my health anxiety and stuff
Sure.
because
Sure.
it's actually like instead of a hurricane happening, it's just now it's just out and open and it's no longer like a storm. It's just there.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Wow. No, I think that's so powerful. All those examples that you shared. Um, And in some of the instances you described, people were able to relate to what you were going through. In the first one with the plane, like they said they weren't anxious about the plane, maybe it was something completely different, but
Hmm.
then they were able to speak some words of encouragement for you, which really made an impact. And I think it's Brene Brown, but she talks about how vulnerability is, necessary for connection.
Yes.
And I think to make the quality connections that we all want and crave as humans, we have to be vulnerable. And being vulnerable means showing people our true selves and taking
Hmm.
off the mask. And, I think there are definitely times, like you talked about, using your intuition where you have to kind of put on your protective barriers, not show everything, not play all your cards because it's not a safe
Right.
situation or you're not going to get the desired outcome. But I think so many times it is important to just show up as yourself because I think that solves a lot of our problems, not everything, but that
Yeah.
connection that we want, that comfort that we want from other people. And I know that I've had to show up as my authentic self in a lot of different situations where people were angry, people were very vocal about disliking me, disliking my beliefs.
Mhm.
I've gotten that a lot as an abuse survivor advocate, just some of the vitriol that you get from that.
Yeah.
Um, But I think one thing that sort of stuck with me, because growing up in a cult-like environment, it wasn't safe to be my authentic self. And I think a lot of people are in positions where it's not safe to do so. But hopefully you can get to a place in your life where it becomes safe to start taking those risks, or the consequences are not as dire, so you can test out and it feels good. But something that has kind of come to my mind and what I've realized is I'm not that special. And I say that because a lot of the things that I put in my mind about why I can't show up as my true self is because nobody else will understand.
Yeah.
And in that respect, it's like, I am so special that I'm having these feelings that no other human has ever had. And so I can't show them because the whole world will be against me if I do. But coming to the realization, I'm not that special. Like, there are billions of people on the planet. And for me to think I'm the only one who's having this struggle right now around this thing, that doesn't even make logical sense. So if I could remind myself, I'm not that special, other people are going through this too. And sure, there'll be people who don't like it, but there's literally, what are we up to, like 8 billion people on the planet? Plus or minus. If I show up as my true self, there will be people who don't like it, but there will also be a lot of people who are like, yeah, me too. And just kind of realizing our emotions and our feelings aren't that different from others. And when we can own that and talk about it, then it gives people, like you said, permission. There's those ripple effects. There's permission for them to say that they are experiencing that too. And you can make that bond and connection with those people. Who maybe have also been feeling like they're so special that nobody else has ever, feeling. And it just kind of reminds me of like children. A lot of times children in their developmental stage, they believe that they cause everything, that everything is always their fault. So if a parent, parents get divorced, you generally have to talk to kids about why that divorce wasn't their fault. That was a grown-up issue. But kids assume that if something bad happens, or they're looking at things so self-focused that they believe that they are that powerful to cause adult people to divorce, or some sort of bad thing to happen. And I think sometimes we, or I, fall back into that childlike thought that I am so powerful that I'm the only one who's experienced this and I'm causing these things. And when you can say it out loud, when you can be your authentic self, then other people are able to say, yeah, I've been experiencing that too. And that we can collectively come together and be like, oh, you know what, this isn't actually our fault, or and just see it from more of that adult self. And yeah, I don't know, those were just some kind of thoughts that were coming up about that for me. And I'm not speaking for other people, but I know those kinds of things come to my mind.
No, that's a good point about kind of reverting to your child self. And I think that kind of ties in with our inner child episode, especially if maybe you were some parents make their children feel like, you're already in that, kind of state of, you're a child, you do kind of think everything happens because of something you did. And then on top of that, if a parent says, well, this wouldn't have happened if you wouldn't have done this, and it's always feeding that energy into that child, then I feel like even as an adult, it is hard, it would be even harder to realize that, a lot of people feel the same way as you. And I think a thing to remember is like, this is a practice. It's like a practice of like meditation or mindfulness or whatever, yoga, like, because when you're in the situation, like when you're really anxious, it feels so real. Like it's easy for us to talk right now because we're like not anxious right now about like, well, you're just telling yourself that you're not special or whatever. You have to kind of do that all the time. You can't just wait until the moment comes, because like, at least in my experience, the voices that are saying like, you're the only one, you're the, whatever, are so loud and they seem so real. You kind of have to like have a foundation so that you can say, okay, wait a second. Like, I think I need to be my authentic self, and let's see, like, let's do like a challenge here and see. And like, the airplane story, that happened almost like 10 months since I
Mm,
learned about being like, I had been practicing for 10 months and I still was like, I don't know, should I just say, like, my gut reaction was still like, let me just not tell them. I'll like, lean back
yeah,
and we won't,
yeah,
so it definitely is a practice. And it kind of reminds me, our whole friendship almost developed off of being like our authentic selves,
yes.
because I just remember like, it's like one of my favorite, like, I don't know if you would say one of my favorite memories, but maybe so. Um, we would just always like, we had we were in certain roles. And so
Yeah.
were like supposed to believe certain things like in the
Uh-huh.
roles. And then we would say, like, one of us would be like, hey, like, and I kind of remember this specific one. We would
Uh-huh.
record our podcast I would record it in the closet to be like, quiet. And so I was whispering kind of, but I was like in a closet and you were like, hey, I don't think that the Bible is like flawless. Like, I don't think it's like perfect. And I
Yes.
was like, oh my God, I've been thinking the same thing. Like, we were like peeling
Wow.
back, right? Like the roles and like all the stuff. And we're saying, like, here,
Yeah.
I'm gonna like show you, like, this is what I believe, even though it's scary, like, to say. And then I'm like, oh my gosh, like, you invited me to be and we would do that all the time. Like, hey, you know what? I don't think I believe this thing we used to believe. And I'd
Yes.
be like, I'm thinking the same thing. Like, we were always like almost parallel, like
Yes.
in our journeys. And so I think this whole podcast was kind of born out of us being our authentic selves with each other, which is really cool. And it makes me really happy because I think that's why I don't know, like, we can just talk forever. And I feel like part of the reason is because we're just like who we are, like, we're just our true selves with each other. So
It's
I thought of
very
that too.
real. And kind of going
Yeah.
back to what you said about like the ripple effect of like when you're your own authentic self, it allows other people to be like, again, the example of this podcast is like we are kind of spurring each other on to be our authentic self and talk about things that maybe most people don't talk about. But then we have listeners literally all over the world who
Yeah.
tune in. And I know there's people that tune into the episodes like as soon as they drop in the morning. And
Uh-huh.
um, you know, it's it's so cool to me to think that we can just be ourselves and that is attracting people literally around the world.
Yeah.
If y'all haven't checked out our Instagram lately, we um, Charlie put up a kind of a map of all the different places people listen in from. And it's incredible. It's like on,
Mhm.
what is it? How many continents? It's like 5 out of 7.
5 out of 7. Yeah, we're not in Antarctica or Africa, which I think
Okay.
Antarctica is kind of out of reach maybe, but
Right.
Africa, like, we need some
Yeah.
people who, if you know anybody in Africa,
Yeah. Tell
send
them to
the
listen
link.
to get it on all. Yeah, but it's just amazing. I think it can be really attractive in the word and not attractive as in like pleasant to look at, but attractive in the sense that like when you like attracts like. And so when you're your
Yeah.
authentic self, it attracts other people who are in their authentic selves. And then you can have deeper and more real connections. Yeah. And then I guess one other thing I wanted to kind of talk about, like, what is the self? Just thinking about,
Yeah.
we're talking about this, we're sort of talking around what it means to be ourselves. And we're kind of talking about like the actions that we take, but like, what is the self? And I'm sure there's a lot of ways to answer that question. But for me, I think the self is not the thoughts that I think. It's not
Mhm.
the things that I do. It is the thing that has the thoughts and the thing that decides to do the things.
Yeah.
Um, and it's sort of like the consciousness, the awareness. And sometimes I think it can be hard to think of ourselves separate from our thoughts because we identify so closely with our thoughts. But
Mhm.
our thoughts are just things that we're having. I think the true self is the thing that is producing those thoughts. And
Right.
so maybe even a good word for it would be almost like our soul or our spirit.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
and I think we can put on different masks or different costumes and play different roles. And I think we have to show up differently. I don't think that it would even be safe or healthy for me to show up in some of my relationships the same way I can be authentic and real with you, Charlie. Like I think
Right.
just wouldn't be, it's not the place for it. Like if I met the president of the United States, it probably wouldn't be a great time to be like, so you believe in aliens, you know? Like,
I mean, what about that CIA report, huh?
Right, exactly. You know? So I mean, I think, you know, there's a bit of, it doesn't mean you're not being your true self if you decide to withhold some information sometimes, but
yeah,
for me, I think it's the thing, you know, behind all of our thoughts, behind all of our actions and intentions. And I don't know, Charlie, when you think of like, what is the self? Like what comes up for you?
yeah, no, I agree. And I think a good way, I think when I first kind of heard that, I was like, it's hard for me to like picture that. Like how do you picture the self, right? If it's not thoughts or if it's not like my body. Um, but like thinking of like just different stories I've heard that kind of make sense of that. Like when people have like an out of body experience, when they like maybe almost die, a lot of people say they like are above themselves looking down, like that is who they are, right? Like, and so that's a good indication of like, it's not, we're not our bodies, because you still exist outside of your body. When we, in our episode about astral traveling, that's you, like yourself is the person or the thing that is traveling, right? So it's not, I think that helped me kind of like hearing those different stories, or like even like the signs after death. That it's like that is like the soul of that person showing up. They still exist, whether it's in the form of whatever, like the wind, a bird, like whatever it may be. They still exist, but they don't exist in how we commonly like think about, okay, I know this person, like I know Ashley, she has blonde hair, she like, what, you know what I mean? Like they don't exist, right? Just the energy. And I mean, different people have different energy. We've talked about this, and you can kind of feel it. I think that's a good way to, because it was just so hard to wrap my mind around the whole concept of the self being like a spirit. But I think the energy, like the energy you get from someone, like that's who they are, like that's who their soul is. It's like so hard to explain, but that's a good way to think of it, because it was hard for me for one, like, what do you mean I'm not my body? What do you mean I'm not my thoughts? Like, I don't really, get it, but that's helped me a lot to like kind of grasp it more. And I mean, I totally agree with what you're saying. And I agree with that, like, yeah, you're being your authentic self doesn't mean you're exactly the same, like in every single situation with every single person. Like there are, a time and place for different things, but I guess what my mind is that like I was holding back so much of who I was, and I was like fighting to hold back parts of myself in different situations because I was afraid. And that's kind of what I'm getting at. It's like I wanted to share, but I couldn't. Like I wanted to do the podcast, but I was almost thinking of saying like, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't, because I was so afraid of like being myself. So, but yeah, I totally agree. Although I would like to talk to the president about that report.
Probably actually, I was thinking that's a bad example, because I actually would like to ask him about that. And
maybe not like
styles about
maybe like if you're meeting with your like financial advisor, it's not a good time to be like, so aliens, how about ghosts? What about, how's your inner child doing, to the cashier at the grocery store? Like not the time for that. But so, but anyway, it really has changed so much about my life, and I feel so much freer, and like I said, it's a practice, and I still have to sometimes be like, okay, no, I can be brave and I can show up. But it's like one of my favorite things to talk about, because it's changed so much. Just that simple quote of like that, it's when you show up, you're inviting others, and it's this ripple effect, and it's been really meaningful in different like relationships that I've had. So
and the other thing that just popped in my mind is I don't think you can really be loved for who you are if you never show people who you are.
Yes.
And I think we all want to be loved for who we are, not just what we do, not just what our roles are. But if nobody ever knows who that authentic you is, how can they even begin to love it if they have no idea, if you just keep it
right.
And
and how can you love them too?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. One other thing that, you mentioned astro travel, and I've actually started taking a class on astro travel.
Oh yeah. Oh my gosh.
And
Tell us
so,
a little bit.
okay, so far we've just kind of talked about, what astro travel is and how it's different than like meditation, that type of thing.
Mhm.
I haven't actually learned how to do it yet, but I'm in like the beginning stages of learning. And I bought this like pretty silk eye mask, to make things
Uh-huh.
darker so I can close my eyes and not have the light distracting me. Um, but I'm really excited. And I think if you all remember that astro travel episode, I think I mentioned the Monroe Institute, and how they had that paper about astro travel that was, lost for years and found. Well, this lady, she
Yeah.
actually trained at the Monroe Institute, and now she's teaching the class. And so anyway, I'll tell y'all more when I learn how to do it, or maybe I'll visit you. at
I
astro
was just gonna
travel.
say, why don't you come visit me? That's so cool though. I really like I want to hear all about that. Maybe we can do another like
Yeah,
episode on
after I
that
get
after you're
better
done.
at it.
Yeah, because I think that's like it's so cool. Like I said, I feel like maybe I have in my dreams and I
Yeah,
just didn't know.
yeah,
Um, but yeah, like I would love to learn how to do it, like to kind of like control it or like I don't know. I mean, I say control it. Like I mean, I've probably like there's just places in my dreams like a few times that I feel like I've
right,
gone, but
right.
I don't know if that was it or not. But
Yeah,
yeah, come visit me when you learn. Make it your
yeah,
first stop.
absolutely, absolutely. Do you have a serendipitous story today?
Oh my gosh, I don't know. I'm like so bad lately at remembering. Like I when I'm, living my life, I'm like, oh, this was serendipitous, but then I forget. I guess one thing, I don't know if you would call this serendipitous, but I was at the grocery store. This is probably not. This is just a happy story.
Okay.
I was at the grocery store and I was by myself because it was a real usually Nate will go or we'll go together. I don't really like
Uh-huh.
to grocery shop.
Yeah.
And so I had to go by myself because Nate was busy and so oh okay. So I went by myself and I what I really hate doing is I hate like first world problems. Like I hate unloading my cart onto the conveyor belt because
Uh-huh.
I never am fast enough. They're already like,
Yeah.
they're
They're
come
like,
on,
come
put
on.
more
Yeah, peer
right.
pressure. Yeah.
And I'm stressed because like if nobody's bagging, I feel like
Yeah.
I need to be bagging. So if I'm
Right. Right.
putting, it up there and I'm like, oh God, I need to help bag. And I can't even get down there. But then I also need to pay and like everything's
Mhm.
frazzled and I feel like I just, I'm losing everything. So I was like, okay, it's gonna be okay. Like I got this. So
Yeah.
like I'm like loading it. I'm doing good. I'm
Yeah.
doing good. There was somebody ahead of me and they're just about to start, like this person's paying, and I like get the last thing up and I was like,
Whew.
okay, like I did it. And then a guy comes up and says, I'm sorry, ma'am, but this whole system just froze and we're gonna have to move you to another thing. And I was like, are you serious? He has no idea the mental gymnastics that I just did, like the mental work that I
Yes.
just did to get all of this up here. But I was just like, that's fine, like whatever. Like I was not upset because I was just like, you know what? It's practice. This was practice.
Yeah.
So he did pick up some of it and then I picked up the rest and I unloaded it again. And I guess what's serendipitous or happy about this is that
Uh-huh.
he I did start bagging because then nobody was there to bag. So I started to bag and then someone came up and like took over for me. And he was like, you know what? Because we had to make you move and you had to bag your own groceries, I'm gonna give you $5 off. And I was like, well, that was worth it. Like I'll unload and reload any other time, for $5 off. So yeah, it was just kind of funny that I specifically like
Yeah.
dread that and then I had to do it twice.
Nice.
But then I got $5 off for it. So,
I
it's
love
worth
that.
it.
Oh, I love that story so much. Yeah, so I've got kind of an interesting serendipitous story. I'll try not to make it too long, but it really was sort of a big thing. So I went through a lot of depression in February, and I am not the type of person that's like, oh, your depression's here to teach you something. Like, that's
Mhm.
stupid. Like
Yeah.
I look at it as like, your chemicals, hormones are off, probably stress, those types of things. And it is what it is. But this time I did learn something from it. Um, and it was such a wild experience because I felt like, and I know this is common with depression, I felt like a switch was flipped off and all of a sudden nothing in the world meant anything. Like literally it didn't mean anything. Like my relationships, my accomplishments, my goals, my dreams, it was like nothing felt like it had any meaning. And I mean, that's a pretty dark place to be.
Yeah.
And it wasn't, it wasn't a lot of fun. And it sort of felt like, if anybody's ever watched the Matrix movie, the first one where Neo is basically being shown the Matrix, and there's this like bustling city with blue skies and everything's going, and then all of a sudden he's like going to be shown the Matrix, and all of a sudden it just goes dark and it just seems very hollow. It goes to black and white instead of color, and that's really what it felt like. It felt like a switch was flipped and nothing meant anything. And it, like I said, it was not fun. There was a lot of tears and crying, and it was a very strong bout of depression. But when I started pulling out of the depression, it was like the switch flipped back on. And in an instant, all of a sudden, everything meant something again. It all meant something to me. And, I was able to, feel like there was meaning in relationships and meaning in accomplishments and meaning with goals and all these things. But it really puzzled me how quickly something could go from meaning everything to meaning nothing to meaning everything again. And I was doing a lot of thinking, and it almost felt like a spiritual awakening experience where I just had this realization that nothing means anything unless we give it meaning. And so both of those experiences were true and right. Like, if I don't give something meaning, it doesn't mean anything. And if I do give something meaning, it does mean something. And because I'm the one giving things meaning, I get to choose what things mean. And so there was like this sense of freedom that came with it, that, I could make, like just an example, like if I have a product launch and it fails, I can make that mean that I am a failure, this is a stupid idea, nobody wants my products, this is horrible. Or I can make it mean this is a learning experience and I picked up some data from it. Or I can make it mean nothing and just like, well, this happened and there wasn't really a reason for it, I'm not going to place meaning on it. And so it kind of plunged me down this path of realizing that I get to choose what everything means for myself. And that can really affect how I feel and what my emotions are. Now, the serendipity part comes into this. I was talking to my husband about this and I was explaining all of this, and he was like, wow, that's really cool. And then he was like, you know what? I'm literally reading a book that is talking about meaning. And he was like reading it exactly, basically everything I was saying, he was starting to read that in the book. And I'm trying to think of what the man's name was. The book was, it was about like business stuff. So, it didn't really seem like it would apply. But they had this whole section in the book where it described, what it meaning is. And I'm going to try to find the quote really quick here. I think it's, is it Viktor Frankl? I think that might be his name.
Okay.
Goodness, I'm just trying to find it here. Anyway, but he was a guy who survived the Holocaust, and he basically kind of came to the same conclusion that, meaning, things have meaning based on the meaning that we give them. And that was a quote in the book, and there was kind of a whole section in the book about meaning. And I just thought that was so fascinating, how I could be going through something internally and not really having a lot of outside stimulus to kind of get me to that conclusion. Then I tell my husband, he's literally reading a chapter in a book that's talking about that has a quote saying basically what I was just saying. And I don't know, that kind of caused me to feel like, okay, I'm really on the right track here. And so it's kind of a cool serendipitous story how that worked out. I mean, on one hand, it was sort of a dark story, but on the other hand, like I really learned something that's going to be useful for my life. And just having that confirmation that I'm not the first one that thought of it. Like there's literally books written
Yeah.
about it. So
No, I love that. I love that it was like the specific chapter and had the specific
yeah,
quote of like something you were saying already. Like that's so cool. And I love what you said about like I can make it mean like, oh, I'm a failure, whatever, or you know what, like I got some data from it and it's
yeah,
fine. And then I also like how you said, or it could just mean nothing. Like it just
right,
happened. And I like that because I think a lot of times stuff's either good or bad. And
right,
we'll have to say,
right.
well, this was a positive or negative thing, right? But some things
Yeah,
just exist and that's all they do. And that's totally
yeah.
fine if you don't want to give it meaning. And so that was really powerful to hear
Mhm.
you say that
Mhm.
because I think that's really useful of just letting something exist, like,
Yeah, right,
um, because sometimes I will do like cartwheels to try to make something that was bad seem good
right,
for
right.
myself, and then I'm like,
Yeah,
I didn't need to do all that. Like
right, right.
it just happened. It doesn't have to mean
Yeah.
anything.
And sometimes it's too much to ask of yourself to believe that it's something good.
Yes.
Like it's
Mhm.
just too much cognitive dissonance for that. Whereas if you
Yeah.
just not have it mean anything, sort of like a neutral place and
Right.
just
Yeah.
like, it is what it is,
Yeah.
gonna move on and not attach strong emotion to it. And then,
Yeah.
so anyway,
Oh, I love that. And I love that it was just a confirmation that you were on the right track. That is so cool. Oh, that's great. Oh my gosh. Well, if you have any serendipitous stories, or I mean, mine was not serendipitous today. I was just happy, $5 off my groceries.
we love happy.
Yeah. You can send them into us because we want to read them or hear them. You can email us at pod.serendipity@gmail.com, or you can DM us on Instagram at serendipity.pod. You can write in, you can send us like a voice memo, and we may even play it on the show if you do that. And
Yes.
also, like, feel free to send any pictures in. If you have like pictures that like go with your story, like we would
Mhm.
love to see those and share those.
Yeah.
And yeah, we love serendipitous stories. It's the whole purpose of the podcast.
Yes, yes. And if you like the podcast, if you enjoy us being our authentic selves and you want to help that ripple effect expand, leave
Mhm.
us a review, preferably 5 stars.
Yes. Yeah.
And if you leave us a review, if you take a screenshot of it before you hit submit on Apple Podcasts, then send that to us either on Instagram or our email, which again is pod.serendipity@gmail.com. And we'll send you a free thank you gift, which is some beautiful custom artwork. And it's formatted for either print to hang on your wall or on your different electronic devices. And yeah, help us spread the ripple effect and encourage other people to be their authentic selves. And leaving a review helps us reach more people. And we'd really, really appreciate that.
Yeah. I love that. Well, make sure you come back next week. We have a very special, I say very special, it's my story. A special serendipitous story that I'm really excited to share because I think it's super cool.
Yes.
And yeah, we'll see you next week.